Hello and welcome to this episode of Heretic Hammer. I am your host, Marshall. This is my co-host, Dylan.
We're back.
We are. And more importantly, today we're talking about the faction, the character that you are based off in the visualizations of for the video episodes. And that's the Imperial Guard.
That's great. They're really strong and powerful, right? That's why you would have put my face on them, because they're really strong and powerful.
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, the reality is pretty much remember, kind of like we went through in the first episode, the greatness of 40K is, in a way, every army has their own facet of being overpowered. It's just in different ways.
Everyone gets the participation trophy here.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the other one is the other statement is that everyone in 40K is evil is the other statement, but which we did say as well, but again, that's a different story.
I don't know if I like that one as much. I'll stick with that first one.
I think it's important to know and understand the importance of that. Really, no one in 40K is the good guy. But remember, it's it's the reality that playing the villain can be fun, and it's just about the level of villain you want to play.
That's fair.
Yeah, some levels of villain are maybe more your flavor, right? I mean, for example, my main faction that I play is all about like worshiping the Emperor and spreading his good word around the galaxy. And a lot of times that is done by also then brutally murdering those that don't believe in the Emperor.
Like you do. All right, so what flavor of evil are we going to be looking into today then?
Well, the one thing I want to do first, me and you have spoken in between episodes, and one thing I realized was during our Space Marines discussion with both Chaos Space Marines and non-Chaos and loyal Space Marines, that I didn't really talk about them from a gameplay perspective, right? Because, part of my goal with this is to get you and any of our listeners also into the tabletop game. And Space Marines are so lore heavy, it's really easy for me to get carried away with it. So I wanted to spend maybe just a minute or so on each Space Marine for a moment, just to kind of give a lowdown of what they're like. Because honestly, I can kind of do that.
And we're talking specifically from a gameplay perspective in this case.
Yes. Kind of how how it works with their lore a little bit, Space Marines on the tabletop generally do play actually very openly. The benefit of Space Marines is that if you have a way you want to play the game, Space Marines have a way. Especially in 10th edition, while we're making these episodes, Space Marines generally allow you to do whatever the hell you want, which is what makes it really easy to describe. Because do you want to play stealthy? There's a Space Marine faction for it, the Raven Guard. You could technically even do the Alpha Legion if you wanted to, and both a loyal or a chaos twist if you really wanted to. You can paint the models however you want. You can, as we've noted, you can always make your own custom stuff. Because there's 60,000 divergent chapters of Space Marines out there. You can just kind of make your own lore. You want to use a lot of melee. Well, there's a few options we talked about. You could be White Scars, you could be Blood Angels, you could be, and for Chaos Space Marines, you could kind of. Honestly, most of the Chaos Space Marines are going to actually lean a little bit more in the melee realm, especially the ones that are like Chaos tainted and have like some type of warp demon arm. Those ones are going to be more melee anyway. So the benefit and why this is really easy to discuss very quickly is that the reality is Space Marines are one of the best new person armies to play because you can play every phase of the game pretty much, and you can do them each decently well. Like, you don't really have, none of them are necessarily your weak spot. You know, you're not like hyper specialized in any of them, but none of them are your weak point.
Okay, I get that. That makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
gonna go ahead and write down on the subject of flavors. I'm assigning an ice cream flavor to each one of these units that we discuss in terms of their gameplay. So I'm putting Space Marines down as Neapolitan because they are able to fit multiple flavors depending on what it is you're trying to do. So
Yes. And
we're
then
assigning
CSM would
Neapolitan to
be
Space Marines.
CSM would be Neapolitan with fruit.
Ooh, interesting.
Because they can do just about everything, but they do two things generally more, and that's like psychic powers, because they don't have the rules against psychers like the Imperium does. You know, they generally are pretty open about it, being chaos worshippers and all that, and that's where psychic power comes from, if you recall.
Yep,
And
bit more of an open door policy.
yeah. And then the other thing they do more of is, as I mentioned, melee, especially because they'll have possessed units. And not even that, honestly, it's just even a lot of the legions that turn traitor, just very heavily melee friendly. You know, even Iron Warrior is a decent example of that. They are very good at shooting in lore wise, but they also are able to kind of get up to you slowly, but get up to you and then beat you down.
So Space Marines and Chaos Space Marines, if they're so good for melee, my assumption, having not played the game at all, is that you would probably be putting them kind of more towards your front line in that case.
I mean, because it's the whole army, you're generally going to have just a balance. It's, you know, just CSM will probably have more units moving forward, but the benefit of Space Marines is, while you can kind of make your flavor whatever way you want it. You know, you want to run a lot of flamers and not a lot of melee, there's an option for that. You know, you want to run a lot of melee, there's an option for that. You want to just do normal shooting, not flamer side, there's an option for that. But other than that, we can move on now to this episode proper. Finally be done with Space Marines. Talk about the Imperial Guard, or the Astra Militarum.
And what is it exactly that they do?
So here's the thing. One of the things that a lot of new players and lore enjoyers get, the misconceptions that they get when coming into 40K, is it always kind of feels as though, and a lot of people will think that Space Marines are like the main fighting force of the Imperium, right? Because so many of the books are about them being on the front lines, the games, so many things that we see, you know, the cinematics are Space Marines. But the reality is that's not the case anymore. You know, in the Great Crusade, that pretty much was, you know, because there were, you know, every legion had, you know, like hundreds and thousands of Space Marines, and their goal was to subjugate and bring in all of these wayward planets that were once part of, you know, human society and were lost due to Old Night. But, you know, now the Emperor wanted to bring them back together into the fold under his banner. But ever since this Horus Heresy, and all the Space Marines kind of had to become chapters and diverge more and have less individual units per thing, they needed a proper, united, gigantic fighting force. So the Imperial Guard became way bigger, because in a way the normal humans fighting force always existed. There was always an Imperial army, right, that had non-genetically modified soldiers at its helms. But it used to be, you know, a little bit smaller in comparison to Space Marines. Now, very different. Now it's kind of almost just like honestly, there's probably, I don't know if this is explicitly accurate, but it's not necessarily wrong for me to say that there's probably about 10,000 guardsmen per one Space Marine.
Okay, that's a big number.
Yeah, the Space Marines maybe are in the millions, but the Guardsmen are in the trillions across the entirety of the Imperium. They are they are effectively just like the human swarm. I mean, if you look at, I mean, when you look at like imagery of their like art and imagery of them, you'll generally find them like always in these large numbers in these battles. There's never like a small unit load of them.
Okay, so these guys are essentially the grunts, and then a space marine showing up is like Master Chief popping up on the field.
Very actually closely to that concept, because if you played Halo, you would actually kind of know, like, whenever Master Chief shows up, they're like, oh my god, it's Master Chief,
Yeah, no, it's
Master
a big
Chief.
deal, and yeah,
Yeah, and an Astartes showing up to the battlefield is like that. Like the they're kind of the Space Marines are noted as the Emperor's angels, and most humans view them that way, as obviously the whole Emperor worship, but also because they're so rare to see. It feels like an angel has descended to the battlefield to save your regiment and fight alongside you in the glory of the Imperium. It is a religious experience to them.
gameplay wise, does having a space marine, are there any kind of like effects or boons that a space marine gives to the Imperial Guard just
No.
by
So
nature being there?
this is actually a great question to bring up in this. So the way that, because we haven't really gone into the basics of the game yet, and it's because honestly it's way easier to, and like a
There's a
basis
game
of this. The basis of this is to like start with the lore and then kind of talk about how maybe they just kind of generally play in the game, and then we'll go over the actual gameplay later. But
Absolutely.
one thing that is good to note is that every faction we talk about are going to be different individual factions. So like the Astra Militarum and then the Adeptus Astartes, or Space Marines Imperial Guard, are two separate factions. So while a lot of Imperial units or factions can ally with each other, a lot of these kind of bigger ones, so like Astartes and whatnot, don't generally then ally with like the Guard. So actually, the answer to that question is they don't do anything, because they can't even be on the same board with each other in terms of of an army. A lot of times with 40K, what you're doing is like so like each of these factions we talk about, they're going to be their own thing. But the Guard themselves still are inherently a worthwhile fighting force. But there's one aspect about that that's important, and that is, you may be able to kind of guess this, right? A Space Marine, they are given this really heavy armor. They're given these unique and gilded weaponry. So when they die, they have units that are there to collect their gene seeds so that they are able to make another Space Marine, and they'll try to get servitors to collect armor and all that, or at least just try to get the dead out of the battlefield, because one Space Marine is inherently so valuable. But when you have a trillion guardsmen, you can probably guess that they're like, that's a lot of people. We need to make this a little less expensive.
Right, of course.
So you'll notice now that a lot of times when you see guardsmen, you'll see them honestly in a very World War One, World War II aesthetic, right? And honestly, depending on the type, you might even see one that looks like it's earlier. There's a wide array of styles of guardsmen. But the most common one you'll see, which we'll talk about in a moment when we get into more of the specific kind of regiments, are going to be this kind of Cadian style that is very World War II armored look, and then kind of World War One mix.
Okay.
But the two things that are the most important to helping that like expenses part is obviously their armor is just like flak armor, like just normal flak armor that is maybe just like a little bit sturdier than what you have today, you know? And then the one important weapon of the Imperial Guard is the humble las gun. It is a gun that doesn't jam. If you were to be hit by it, it could blow off a limb. It fires, as kind of the name implies, a powerful, beam of energy that charges into the opponent. It can fire a lot of rounds for like a really small energy pack.
So did I hear that right?
That's operating off a battery.
That's las gun as in LAS or LAZ?
LAS. Yep. LAS gun.
Okay. Is that an acronym or is that just like short for laser or something
pretty
like that?
Pretty much. It's just short for laser gun. Yeah. It's not an acronym. It's, it's obviously just, it's an, obviously classic naming, like probably old naming scheme from old GW stuff,
Sure.
Stuff like that. And, this is inherently a devastating weapon compared to modern day. It is incredibly weak in 40k terms. It would barely even, if this hits, a space marine, like a chaos space marine, they'd barely flinch. Most orcs aren't really going to be hit too hard by it. It's really useful mainly on similar weak fleshy human-like beings. It is, jokingly said, a flashlight in 40k.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But let's go into a little bit of a small analogy here. If for you, somebody throwing a, not a tiny pebble, but like a quarter-sized rock at you, decently hard, it would hurt a lot. Sure, might give you a cut, but you're not going to die from it, like especially if it's the average person, not like a baseball pitcher. But now you get 100,000 of those people, and they all throw rocks at you constantly. You're gonna die.
Sure, it's the accumulation of the hits. It's death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly, and that is very much how much of the guard works. And while the lasgun is probably one of the most popular weaponry with the guardsmen, they also do have auto guns. So like essentially just like a modern like assault rifle, and they, depending on your rank and whatnot, there are other levels in your detachment to get other of the weaponry. It's just the most common will be the auto gun and the lasgun, especially the lasgun. From like especially a classic guard perspective standpoint. But you might be wondering, so if you got such a large, why would you need such a large army? And that's really because, and again, this number probably isn't accurate, but that's generally what you need when your army has effectively a 60% mortality rate.
Yeah. So, because even if their flashlights aren't exactly doing a lot of damage unless it's the full culmination. I mean, essentially, as you lose units, that means that the effectiveness of those weapons is just decreasing over time.
Right, and that's how they can end up losing, in many scenarios. But it's also just like they're wearing flak armor. Like if they're fighting an orc, if they aren't able to stop that orc before it reaches them, that orc will just like do one swipe and kill 20 people.
Right, the armor will stay intact as they fly 50 feet through the air and crash.
Yeah, even
into the
if
ground.
It does, like it might not even do that. Sure. That orc's chain axe might just go right through him, or just not even chain axe, just like. I mean, some orcs have like a rocket propelled axe.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things out there that could just cut right through that dinky little flak armor. It's a lot like when you watch the alien invasion movies where like the aliens are just like immediately disintegrating, our normal soldiers of today because it's essentially what's happening.
Right.
But again, they're cheap, so they're replaceable. And there are, possibly quintillions of people in the universe. But you may be wondering, well, if there's a 60% mortality rate, why would you want to join this? If you're super likely going to die. And now is kind
for space democracy, I'm assuming?
in a way. But not democracy. An Imperium, damn it. The Emperor demands it. But and honestly, actually, like the Imperial Guard, if you want to know why, honestly, people could be attracted to the Imperial Guard, people who love Helldivers will, I think, fully understand why we would like the Imperial Guard. Because that is incredibly, like, fitting. Like, they're the good guards units because inherently they, quote-unquote, live. So this is kind of a good point to transition into, then, the kind of 5 common world types or planet types that you'll kind of hear in 40K lore often, right? There's a lot more, but generally these are the 5 you'll end up hearing about, especially like characters or something being from, or the type of planets that maybe Space Marines or even these guard regiments will come from. And that is, which one we talked about already, which is a death world, like when we talked about Caliban. There is hive worlds or hive cities. There are paradise worlds, which kind of are what they sound like.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. There are forge worlds. And then the last one being an agriculture world or agri world or farm world. They all kind of, people throw around different parts. And actually, a great example of a farm world guardsman is in a great kind of intro book to 40K called 15 Hours. It's not in print anymore, but you could find it pretty cheaply in like probably used bookstore or eBay. It's not like it's not like it's one of those like crazy rare, well liked, or not well liked, but you know what I mean? Like it's not like it's one of those books that like goes into into great lore.
So if I find it, I can't flip it on the eBay market and then use that money to buy a bunch of miniatures, is what you're saying?
Not likely, no.
Okay. Well, there goes my plan.
But what it does do though is it does have a great kind of story part to showing you one of the ways that people end up going into the Imperial Guard. So what'll happen is, essentially every planet will, when they're part of the Imperium, they will owe a tithe or some type of tax to the Imperium as a whole. And
always comes back to taxes.
Yeah. So a lot of times that will end up being, soldier, whether it be money or resources, and sometimes those resources are soldiers, especially if you're a death world. That's really all you can give, because you don't really have, if you're a death world, you don't have any resources on your planet. But in agri world, there is only resources, right? They're farming, but the other issue with that is they're also generally fairly low populated. So most of their taxes and tithes are done in the export of farmed goods. But the problem is, obviously, they still every now and then do need extra people, especially maybe in the area. Those agri worlds are a lot like, like a farm today, where it's like they will use the modern technology, in that case it's 40K technology, but like the modern technology in order to farm the land. They're not like completely backwater. They're a little bit, obviously, but not totally. So like Hive City or Hive World, those are planets where essentially they're like Coruscant in a way, right? Like where it's just nothing but this giant compact city filled to the brim with people, with millions and billions of people. Gotcha. Why don't they grab a bunch of people from that? Well, again, they do have jobs. They do go home. They have hobbies, families, and all that. You do need people to do that. Now, they do definitely draft a lot from those worlds, but otherwise you go home. You maybe go to a bar, casino, if you have a family, go to your family. You can go to museums. There is stuff on these worlds. It's just it's just dependent on where you are in the economic scale.
So would it be correct to assume that there's some kind of like a class or caste system on these hive worlds?
100%. Most of them will have that. And especially, the lower you are, the more you work, and the inevitably harder it is to climb that social scale. And the higher you are, the less you need to do, and the richer you are, the more you get to do for yourself. It's very much kind of that level of society in a lot of these worlds. Not everyone's the same, obviously, but that's we're going through the general gists here. And so one of the things then that people will do, obviously, if they're stuck and they don't like their lot in life, they will be like, well, you know what? I'll join the Guard, because if I live, then I might as well, then I could come back and potentially get a better job and then increase my social standing and then maybe have a better life, And the reason that, especially in a lot of these hive cities, that people will have that opinion, because it's like, yeah, they might die, but yeah, even if they don't have a shitty life, right? Like, even if their life isn't terrible, there's still the chance that they just walk out their door and a gang decides it would be cool to play a prank by planting a bomb at your doorstep, and you just die anyway. So you're about as likely to potentially die for some random incident in a hive city as maybe you are in the Guard. Some would argue. Not everyone, but some would argue. So it's like, why not enlist? Make something of your life, And obviously propaganda. Propaganda always plays a good role in these things.
Is there any kind of like a post-war, like a bond or something that you would receive? Like if you, after serving, like I guess the real question is, like, do you ever retire from service?
I imagine that's not the case with everyone, and sometimes it's just like, maybe there is a little bit of a bond thing. That's one of those things that isn't always like crazy gone over, but like a good type of series to look at. That would be good to learn more about people that could have that type of background would be the 40K detective novel series.
There's a detective series within 40K?
Oh yeah. And honestly, they're generally very interesting, and you learn a lot about hive cities that way and kind of everyday life in the Imperium. Because these aren't like inquisitors uncovering a grand scale. These are detectives on a planet who are inevitably looking for answers to just real crimes.
Wow.
It's not like we need to travel to these 3 planets and find the key to Agramankabar in order to stop this chaos plot. They're like, there's a serial killer around this hive city. We need to find and stop them.
Huh.
So it's very humanistic, which is nice. Which,
yeah,
kind of bringing it back, is why a lot of people like the Guard. And there's a couple of different types of Guard. Oh, I want to talk about the other planets quick. So, as I mentioned before, some of the other planets, we talked about the Agro world. Paradise world, generally never going to give anything to the Guard, because, as you could guess, Paradise world, generally it is filled with nobles, and even the servants who are there as servants generally have a pretty good life and aren't going to want to go anywhere.
Sure.
So they generally will pay their tithes with like money because of tourism and all that. Death worlds are where you will find, again, where it's just the world is so barren, and it's classified by the Imperium as a death world if it cannot give any type of resource other than its people. So those would be worlds that are just like borderline barren and aren't even worth honestly making a whole lot of upkeep with. So they'll get generally ignored by the Imperium for that matter. there are some death worlds that have given things who again, their way of dealing with it though is that they just give soldiers. And one of those are the ones we're going to talk about when we talk about our units here. So now we'll kind of properly get into some of the regiments that exist. Not all of them. There's a lot. But just some of the most notable ones.
All right, give it to
So
me.
the first one we'll see, which you see as your avatar, you see on the codex cover, you see in most of the art, and that is the Cadians. They come from the planet Cadia, and they are the most numerous place where Guard will be sent out, trained, and whatnot. You know, growing up in Cadia was very much like, you will fire your first weapon at 6. You will learn to do drills by 12. And by 15, you will have gone through most drills, and by 18, you are in the Guard. It is
very child
that
soldier
level.
friendly.
Well, and it's because it's just that their Cadia itself. The reason that is because Cadia itself is right next to the Eye of Terror. So, like, they are the first planet that if there is going to be like demons coming out of the Eye of Terror to try to come plague some world, like Chaos Space Marines especially, first stop, Cadia.
When you say right next to the Eye of Terror,
I mean as close as you can get without being sucked in.
see, that's fascinating to me because it's hard for me to imagine how you would be able to set that up. I guess remind me, how often is anything coming out of the Eye of Terror?
I mean, again, it'll usually be like a warp storm will bring out a set of demons. But otherwise, a lot of the time, things coming out of the Eye of Terror are Chaos Space Marines, especially the Black Legion. So being next to the Eye of Terror is kind of just like being next to, like, it's kind of like just being nearby a wormhole in a way.
So does Cadia just constantly get attacked? I guess that's kind of what I was
Pretty much
getting to. Is like it's hard for me to imagine them as like, this is where we're going to establish sort of this base of operations where we're going to be, training our future soldiers, when I feel like it'd be just constantly under siege from whatever tumbles out of the wormhole on any given day.
Well, that's the thing, though, right? That's why because it's the first line of defense. It is your planet. You're not going to give up your planet. And so the number one place that you're going to be, where the soldiers are going to be is going to be on Cadia. And most of them are going to pretty much 90% of that civilization is going to be soldiers. That's just the way it is.
Sure.
But, it doesn't really matter all too much because Cadia exploded.
Okay, see, there we go. Now we're getting, yes, this was the inevitable conclusion that I was assuming was going to happen.
So the thing about Cadia, and if you're a Guardsman fan, especially an Acadian Guardsman fan, you might fall into tears when this gets brought up and you'll scream Cadia stands at the top of your lungs. But Cadia, as subject to many of these Black Crusades, during the 13th Black Crusade, done by the Black Legion, by Abaddon the Despoiler, Cadia fell. Essentially, Abaddon found this gigantic, just like big rock thing that inevitably is Necron in origin, but not discussion for today. And just hurled it into this planet. He just like found a way effectively, not literally, but like effectively apply jet boosters to it and just slammed it into Cadia.
No amount of units is going to be enough to defend against that in any meaningful way.
No, especially then what happened because of that is it created, because of this, the thing that it was, what it did is when Cadia then was destroyed, it then ripped, if you remember in the star map that we have for 40K, it ripped that gigantic hole into the Imperium. So like all of that, that Cicatrix Maledictum, the big warp thing that just cuts, Imperial space in half, is because of that. What was once fine is now completely been ripped through, and it's all because of Cadia falling. But they have established a new source for many of those who did survive and all of those who were able to make it out of Cadia itself, to create a new Cadia, which is a bit to the chagrin of Chaos Space Marine fans, but you technically still got that dub because that gigantic warp wound is still in space. So you can't say that it's completely ruined the victory. Still a dub. Still a dub for that Abaddon.
It doesn't matter, still dub.
Exactly. Scoreboard. So Cadians, though, other than that, that's a big lore thing. I mean, inevitably, the Fall of Cadia is a great book to read about that. The battle of Cadia had been going on in like real world, like us time, for like a decade, because they just were so not advancing the lore for so long. Mm-hmm. So it was a pretty decent event for that. And now we have this split Imperium because of it. So next up, I want to talk about the Death Corps of Krieg. The Death Corps of Krieg are crazy popular amongst 40k fans in general, honestly. People love their aesthetic, their World War I, the gas masks. It's
giving Killzone.
Yeah, I mean, people love them. They have a very strong meme in shovel, and that's because inherently one of their common melee weapons is the tactical shovel. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? World War I, they used a lot of shovels would be a melee weapon. Look, I can't bring up the Death Corps of Krieg without bringing up the shovel meme. It has to be done.
This is the Team Fortress 2 level of nonsense that I'm looking for. Yeah,
but so their planet, I'll give a small amount of lore. So Krieg, they come from the planet Krieg. You kind of get into the naming convention a little bit here. And it's a death world, much like Caliban, but way worse. Because there was a civil war on Krieg, and the loyalist general was like, they were in a stalemate. Like, they just were not advancing any one way or the other. And the Imperium just was like, up until you lose, we're not giving you any more reinforcements, because you're behind on your tithe, you're behind on taxes, and we're not going to waste a bunch of resources to have you continue to fail. So up until you lose, we're not bringing anyone else. So it's either win or die. Pick one. The Imperium is a little harsh.
Yeah.
And so what the loyalist general decided to do, as you could guess, somewhat after kind of losing it a little bit, was that he found essentially a bunch of these warheads and effectively just nuked the planet. Like, he brought all of the loyalists into underground tunnels and, bunkers, and just glassed the planet. It is uninhabitable above ground. Hence, the gas masks. It's too irradiated. They need to be protected. Now, there's a couple of theories about the gas masks. Obviously, because they never take them off. Ever. And there are two theories around that are because, A, they're so irradiated now that they're like borderline mutants, and so think like ghouls from Fallout. Sure. Gotcha. So in order to not be branded as mutants, they keep the mask on. That's what they do. The other theory is that they were actually clones of that general. Like in order to, because like Krieg's like reasoning for giving soldiers to the Imperium is like they feel guilt for having gone through this civil war and having had to destroy their planet and all that. So like their way of redemption is to go into service and just blitz into battle. So like they will fight with a crazy fervor. They will put themselves in harm's way. They fight to the end, and they fight hard. Like they do not pussyfoot around. They're as loyal as it gets, and they're as deadly as it gets when it comes to guardsmen. And finally, for like planet-based warriors, I want to talk about another wide favorite of people, and that is the Catachin jungle fighters.
Rambo.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? So like these models kind of come from like late 80s, 90s. And so their initial design, very Rambo. But in terms of their planet, it's actually very Predator. Like their
or like
whole
Turok,
planet,
yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, like their whole planet is absolutely that. Like it's like spending a night on Catachin is like being a character in a Predator movie or being in Turok. Like you are just constantly being hunted by things and creatures that are inherently way stronger than you and will absolutely murder you, which is why many people are big fans of them still, especially if they like the Rambo stuff, because inevitably that's what they are. They're forced to be tough fighters. A more modern book is Catachin Devil, but otherwise,
do they use a lot of like guerrilla tactics then?
Oh yeah. They're very melee, and they are very battle hardened. Like no horrors could compare to a night on their planet. So they will also fight. They, however, have one problem. Their model is old. They don't have a modern sculpt, and it's multiple decades old now. And if you were to look at it, I'm gonna show I'm gonna show Dylan an image of their models, and if you're an audio listener, go to warhammer.com, search Catachin Jungle Fighters. And then obviously if you're watching this on YouTube, brace yourselves, because this is what they look like.
Oh man. They really put the best one front and center, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah.
The Frank guy. Miller of it all, that's just.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah. Well, okay. So hear me out. Are the Catachin Jungle Fighters? Are they a popular group? Is it like, do a lot of people play them? Is there a reason that they've just not done a reprint in so many years?
There's not a reason. No. I don't. I mean, I think they're popular when it comes to lore, and a lot of, especially fans of, of especially old 40K. And I'm sure plenty of new 40K fans would also love them, but they just haven't gotten really any love in any recency. But a lot of people do like them a lot, and so you'll see a lot of people make their own custom models, stuff like that. But they haven't had a refresh ever, and so unfortunately, they could use one badly. And for why GW hasn't, don't know. We'll actually get into a couple units of note now. One of them to bring up is the Tempestus Scion. Just it's a popular kind of, especially from like a lore and design standpoint amongst people. They're essentially like the paratroops of the guardsmen. They're a little bit heavier armored, and are very good at, are some of the combat specialists of the Astra Militarum.
I do like their design. I definitely do get that like airborne, the paramilitary or like a dropship trooper type thing from them.
Yeah, I mean, they don't actually use like a parachute. They, just have like a pack that like levitates them down slowly.
Oh
Like when
god,
they get
no,
close.
the parachute would
But
have to somehow be made of steel to be
yeah,
effective in any way.
yeah, no, it'd be bad time.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like but still, nevertheless. And then another important like unit member of the Imperial Guard are commissars. And they are, like I said, they are a very special kind of unit in the Imperium. And that's because they aren't an officer in the traditional sense. So they're kind of like the loyalty. They're a little bit like, and again, I'm being very general here, but they're a lot like the kind of loyalty checks for a lot of guards, even units. They'll be a general and they'll command the unit, and then they will rely on that commissar to ensure that the duty is completed. So they are very highly trained officers of the guard, but like they don't just like raise up from being a normal private into this. They are trained. They are like ROTC'd into being a commissar. The big thing that they're known for, like the meme you'll get with them, is the guardsman freaking out on the front line. He's like, "Oh my god, we're surrounded, we're gonna die," and the commissar will just shoot him in the head and be like, "You fucking stay where you are, fight these goddamn orcs." Like they will keep you on the line, but they will fight, and they're good at it.
They're a bit of a shepherd. They're a bit of a sheep herder in that sense.
Yes, very much so. The one I'm showing you right now, and what I am showing to Dylan right now, is actually Commissar Yarrick. He is one of the most beloved commissars in all of 40K.
Oh, this is a guy. This is an established dude.
This is a real character. And that arm is because he fought an orc war boss, lost his arm, continued to fight. The war boss didn't want to kill him because he effectively respected his level of a fighter that much that he's like, it would be boring if you died.
Huh.
So Yarrick took the arm from an orc, made it his arm, and continued to fight and hold the line of the planet Armageddon for a long ass time.
Okay, now hold on. You're telling me... hold on. So, we're going to call this planet Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Did Armageddon hold? Or did Armageddon get blown up too? Because if you're going to tell me that the planet Cadia got blown up, but Armageddon of all planets did, like, we might as well just toss this whole thing out.
Armageddon is one of the like oldest kind of like war planets, like war story planets in 40K. Like there's so many books around it. It's like inevitably what like the first edition of 40K is like kind of based on, like story wise, like the concept of the Crimson Fist fighting the orcs on Armageddon. There's a whole thing with that. Like Armageddon goes back a long ways. But let's finally get into, how did the guard work then on the tabletop? Because inevitably, if you're supposed to have this kind of swarm, of people, of bodies, how do you play with them on a board? Do you have to get, 50,000 models? And the answer to that is no. But you're going to get a lot of vehicles. Because if there's not one thing that the guard loves, it's their vehicles. Tanks, artillery, walkers. If it can be strapped onto heavy guns, they'll get it, baby.
So do these armored vehicles, I'm assuming there's like a set number of units that they can house in each one?
Yeah, of course. There's a limited number of seats for any vehicle, and there's always things in and around that. I mean, they have transport vehicles, of course, but They also just have a large number of different tanks and different, just like I said, they have the walkers. They will just even have heavy weapons units where they'll just like essentially like, it's like setting up the MG42, like on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
Mortar fire, artillery. If they can rain it down on you, they will. If you look at the Astra Militarum like codex cover, you can see like while it's like a swarm of bodies, in the back of it is like this tank cresting over the field or like over the hill,
literally coming up over the horizon.
Yeah. And that's like a big thing, right? Like just vehicles themselves are just so important to the Militarum. One of the classics for it is the Lehman Russ battle tank. That is like one of the most classic tanks for the Imperium, and it can be loaded with multitudes of like types of guns. It can have kind of like a stubbier gun.
Oh god, that sticker sheet just gave me like a heart attack.
There's a lot of options for decals. But yeah, you can have like a plasma gun. You can have a stubbier tank gun. There's a lot of configurations for the Lehman Russ out there, named after the Primarch Lehman Russ. There's also more newly modeled the Rogel Dorn. Kind of a bigger tank. And it looks beautiful. It's a very cool looking model. A lot of firepower on it as well, as you could guess.
Yeah, certainly.
There is the most iconic tank of all of the Militarum, and that is the Baneblade.
The Beyblade?
The Baneblade.
Sorry, sometimes I just hear what I want to hear. Okay, the Baneblade.
So the model, I don't think really does it enough justice. You can kind of see it in comparison to the height of like what it would be to a Space Marine, right?
Yeah, exactly, a Space Marine. Yeah,
it's huge. This is a monstrous tank, and when it goes on the battlefield, it is just destruction incarnate.
So maybe this is an obvious. Maybe this is an obvious question, and I'm asking it independent of the actual gameplay aspect of things. But why wouldn't the Imperial Guard? Do they have the resources that they could just roll out a ton of these Baneblades?
No. So it's all dependent, and it's all about resource management. There's two final units I want to talk about with the Militarum. You have your Tempesta Scions, which are, a little bit more heavily armored drop troops. Maybe you have certain other units, depending on like your scenario, like the Attilan Rough Riders, which go into battle in the 41st and 2nd millennium, literally on horseback, despite it being robotic horsed, or like cybernetic enhanced horse, but still on horseback.
Huh. Okay.
Or you get a bunch of Ogrins and Bulgrins. What are Ogrins?
Yes, that was the question I was about to ask. Yes.
Yes. They are what's called an abhuman, effectively a mutated human. So they are, for all intents and purposes, human, but they are the size of an ogre. They are like just ogre humans.
Oh, okay.
And Bulgrins essentially just Ogrins, but like the melee version of it.
Yeah.
But the Ogrins are amazing characters, very well beloved. Why? Because while they're these gigantic, hulking people, they are just as dumb as a rock. They can barely say more than 3 words at a time, and if you talk to them, it has to be like you're talking to a toddler. But here's like a great thing about the Ogrin, and definitely like why people love them, and it comes from the game Dark Tide. when you play the Orgrin, you get a grenade type. And before one of the recent like kind of class reworks, the way that their grenade is it was a box of grenades. Like they had a whole box of grenades. And instead of priming those grenades and throwing the grenades individually, they just chuck the box of grenades at their enemies.
Perfect.
Now it's updated, so that box will now explode. But instead, one of their grenade options is a rock. And you might be thinking, oh, this must be a big or special rock. I mean, it's a decent sized rock, but it's a rock. It's just a rock. Only a rock. But you throw it at anything. A special corrupted foe, or just the normal, like, kind of thinking in the Left 4 Dead perspective, the special infected or the normal zombie. Throw it at any of them, dead. Throw it at their head, dead. So that rock may just be a rock, but it works when it counts, when it kills you.
And how often do they get to throw rocks?
Whenever they find a rock.
Great.
And on a battlefield, you can find lots of rocks.
Oh, of course.
Other than that, is there any final questions you have on the Imperial Guard?
I think I've got a good understanding of them. You know what I want to close out on? I don't know if I ever truly mentioned this in our previous episodes. But, obviously we had a really big focus on the Space Marines and Space Marines history. But when we were talking about those jungle factions, I feel like it really hit me that one of the things about 40K, we've talked about Space Marines being this kind of poster child for the series. When everybody thinks of Warhammer 40K, they think of the Space Marines or the Chaos Space Marines. And one of the biggest takeaways I have had is the variety that exists within the world of 40K. And the actual sheer scope, I feel like, is really, like, I'm really starting to comprehend just how much variety there is within all of these different units and different planets and the types of stories that are being told. I mean, you literally told me today that there are detective stories that exist in 40K. It never occurred to me in the entire time that I've heard about this that there could even be stories like that, because I've always seen it as just Space Marines versus Space Marines with some orcs peppered in. And there's just so much more to it that I just did not know about until now.
But like, I've loved the lore from like the video games long before that. And a big thing with that is just learning about, over the many years, just like all of the crazy levels of differences that exist in 40K. And that's why I love it so much. That's why it intrigues me, because it tickles my sci-fi fantasy enjoyment. Like, I like the kind of mix of sci-fi fantasy that is the universe has. I've always loved the aesthetic because of that. But that'll do it for this week. I'm not going to say what's next week because I haven't fully decided yet. So you'll have to just tune in next week to find out what we're talking about.
Ooh.
Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching and for listening. And we'll see you next time.
Farewell.